topic, standing.
We're now
So
recording.
thank you. Questions are really important, I think, for the success of this. But let me give you some real background. One of the things I would say first about these Black troops is that they were the first, I would argue, America's first African-American federal employees. Because in the job that they took, if they did it for 30 years, they could go to the soldiers' home, albeit segregated there in Washington. They could apply for a pension. They had basically a primitive form of the VA, but they were federal employees with retirement benefits. That can be said of very, very few other people. You might argue the post office, but very few other people had that opportunity. I will let you guys know that even before I was doing the Civil War, I had 10 years with the Indian Wars, doing stuff at places like Fort Davis. And then I was with a group called the General Miles Marching and Chowder Society for about 15 years. They're defunct now, but they were a very hard-headed and very dedicated Indian Wars organization. And I mean, the first sergeant was God. There was no rank above first sergeant. I mean, you were doing something to be a corporal. So I had some experience with that, but I also had two relatives who were in the ranks of the regular Army after the Civil War that I can point to. One is a guy you've probably heard of named Benjamin Davis Sr., and he was at places like Fort Robinson in Nebraska and other places. He went on later, of course, in World War II to become the first Black general officer in the U.S. Army. And he's related by marriage. It's not like it's a direct blood relation. The other guy is a guy named John R. Anderson. And he lived in a house on Acker Street Northeast that I lived in for a while. He married into the family, and he had been recruited at Bedford, Virginia, and was all over the Southwest and in the Apache campaigns. And he was a private, then he was a corporal, then he was a private, then he was a corporal, then he was a private. His last job was at the War College there in DC, teaching officers how to ride. So he was in infantry and cavalry over his 4 hitches. He didn't do 6 though. He would have had to do 6 to get his retirement. So he got out and married and went into private business. He worked at the old Commodore Hotel down there on Capitol Hill. And the best job he could get was running an elevator at that hotel. So, he did what he could, but there was only so much he could do. So I was interested in that. And my grandfather had something his dad allegedly picked up on the battlefield at Antietam. They were from Cumberland, Maryland, and I still have it. It's a relic Remington 6-shot revolver. And I've actually renovated it, so it's actually technically functional again. I'll never put a round in it, but anyway, that sort of engaged my interest in Buffalo Soldiers and the Western frontier. So we did this earlier, but we did other stuff. This is the second half. So in 1866, tired of one kind of war, the United States focused on westward expansion. American Indian tribes bent on preserving and reclaiming their way of life, renewed their resistance, and proved a significant barrier to settlement of the West by whites. In the same year, 1866, the Black regiments were formed. And you guys would probably know that originally there were 6 regiments, not 4. There were 4 regiments of infantry and 2 of cavalry. In 1869, those 4 infantry regiments were consolidated into 2, the 24th and 25th. But originally there were 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st. The Plains Indian had possessed the horse for at least a century and a half, and many had had guns for generations. The U.S. Army had just emerged from a civil war that pitted large armies of infantry and cavalry against each other in a style reminiscent of the tactics used in the days of Napoleon. The Army and the many nations of Plains Indian people would clash in fighting that would extend over 40 years. Plains Indian warriors were experienced horsemen, and this skill in combination with their proficiency with lance, bow, and arrows made them formidable opponents for an army unused to mounted guerrilla combat. Just a moment. They're always doing mowing and stuff around here. Plains Indians also enjoyed the firepower made possible by guns obtained by trade or by gift. Some were annual annuities gifted to them by the Department of Indian Affairs or taken as trophies in combat. How Plains Indians viewed Black soldiers may best be seen through their language. The Comanche call these men Tu Escapana, which translates as Black Red Front. Red Front being the Comanche term for Spanish soldier. So that was a sort of other person soldier. So a Tu Escapana was a Black Red Front. The Lakota, we might know them as the Sioux, would call them Wasichu Sapa, which literally means black white man. Wasichu is white man, Sapa means black. Buffalo soldiers were ordered to place non-treaty Indians on reservations where they often starved. Black soldiers would be ordered to hunt them down and fight them if they refused to stay. Understandably, Indian people often viewed Black soldiers as enemies. One Ute warrior was quoted as saying, "Indian no like Black soldier, Indian heap shoot." Jason Benitez, an Apache, remembered the men of the Black regiments, however, quite differently. He said, "We were living contentedly at Warm Springs, the agency being garrisoned by a troop of Negro cavalry with whom we were on friendly terms." The Black soldier, can you guys hear okay? Okay. The Black soldier saw Indian people through a lens clouded by the dangers of his job, real and imagined.
It doesn't sound that loud on this end, Bill.
I'm sorry, say again?
It doesn't sound that loud on this end.
Okay.
I could hear it a little, but it's okay.
Was that an airplane or was that grass
Okay.
mowing?
Some historians have suggested that Black soldiers were expected, even encouraged, to participate in anti-Indian prejudice in order to help maintain a racial order with American Indians at the bottom. Today, some Americans perceive that Buffalo soldiers and American Indians had more in common than did Black soldiers and white Americans. While there may be some truth in this perception, nothing in period documents suggests that Black soldiers felt a political solidarity with the people they were sent to fight. A primary motive for the Buffalo soldiers seems to have been to gain the respect of white Americans through military service and gain the rights of citizenship for Black Americans through that respect. Private Jacob Wilkes of the 9th U.S. Cavalry reveals the bitter reality of war when he recalled events of the 1874 Red River campaign against the Comanche in the Texas Panhandle. "We destroyed everything in their village," he said. "They had a good many guns, mostly citizens' rifles, and a good supply of ammunition, besides bows, arrows, quivers, lances, etc. Their tents were made of poles over which hides were stretched, and these were burned." To some extent, in peacetime, the Black soldiers could view Indians in much the way Sergeant Niehaus of the White 10th Infantry did while serving at Fort Union, New Mexico. Niehaus was quoted as saying, "The soldiers did not hold hard feelings about the Indians. I could always make friends with them when they were treated right." Of course, they weren't always treated right. That brings us to the end of our first portion. Anybody have any questions about that particular section, Buffalo soldiers and American Indians?
I have a question that this may not be the right place, but for the USCT during the Civil War, there was an examination process to pick the white officers. Are you going to touch on that, how they pick the officers for the Black regiments, or do you want?
I think we will get to this. We will most certainly get to the selection of men for the regiment, and we'll talk a little bit about the officers as well, but that's a great question.
Okay, I like it.
It's a very good question, and I think we will touch on that in a major way. Let me point out too that, and you guys would know this, that myth and misinformation is a major problem in helping people understand and appreciate the service of these Black regular troops. And as we said in the first presentation, they may not have themselves used the term Buffalo Soldier to describe themselves. Things like the Bob Marley song, the Danny Glover's movie Buffalo Soldiers, which starts off with Indian music, by the way, with a sitar. What? The whole idea that these were nothing more than retread Civil War soldiers, that ceased to be true fairly soon into the game. There were a few that stayed from the days in the Civil War, but a lot of guys got out and new guys replaced them. This whole thing about so-and-so is the oldest living Buffalo soldier. Oh man. Now, were they in a segregated regiment? That's one thing, but you know, the whole idea, what does Buffalo Soldier mean? What happens when the last guy from a segregated regiment passes away? The idea that they got inferior gear and uniforms, and this has come up actually in terms of USCT troops, I know of late. But their drill, their food, their service was very much the same. The only difference, as I said before, was racism. So actually, Mike, to come to the next one, the next bit is called Quality is More Important Than Numbers, Creating the Regiments. When the Black regiments were formed, it was expected, as was the case during the Civil War, only white officers would lead them. The common wisdom of the day dictated that Black soldiers could only succeed if led by white officers. This same logic held that if Black soldiers showed bravery under fire, it was due to their natural savagery. And if they failed in combat, it would prove their natural cowardice. No way to win. The lives of these soldiers would be difficult, and so would the lives of the men who had accepted commissions as officers to lead them. The men of the Black cavalry regiments were lucky to have extraordinary officers appointed as their commanders. The colonel of the 9th Cavalry would be dashing Civil War hero Edward Hatch. During the war, Hatch had participated in a daring raid through Confederate-occupied Mississippi under the man named to lead the 10th U.S. Cavalry, Colonel Benjamin Greer, later general. Grierson and Hatch were both veterans of training and organizing men and leading their soldiers in battle. The recruiting officers worked hard to secure sufficient numbers of men to fill the ranks, but a recruiter in Boston was reminded by Colonel Grierson that he should, quote, endeavor to secure the best material as the quality is more important than the numbers. Grierson made enemies for himself among fellow officers, but friends among men of the regiment when he insisted that the word colored would not be attached to his regiment, but the name would be the 10th U.S. Cavalry, period. Many of the Army brass, including General William Tecumseh Sherman, originally doubted that Black troops would make good soldiers. Some officers refused a posting to a Black regiment out of blatant racism or from fear of serving their entire career with Black troops. Veteran Army officers George Armstrong Custer and Eugene A. Carr took equivalent or lower ranks in other regiments rather than serve with Black troops. As the Black recruits drilled for days on end at recruiting depots, they began to take pride in the soldiers they would become, as did their officers. So that brings us to the end of that little bit. But are there other questions about recruiting? The officers would often get sent on recruiting details, and they really used sort of places like New Orleans, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. They really wanted, and Grierson says this in some of his writings, he wanted people who had some independence, even if they had been enslaved previously. So they were looking for people who were blacksmiths, who were wheelwrights, who had been perhaps carriage drivers. He didn't really favor people who'd been field hands, looking for people with a little more initiative and independence.
Question.
Yes, please.
The Army at the time was entirely voluntary. Is that right? No conscription?
It was a regular Army, so there was no draft of any kind.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there, of course, had been in the Civil War Confederates who galvanized, especially in the West, but they were able to leave at the end of either the war or their period of conscription. There were, however, and that brings up a great point, some Black troops who ended up staying in longer from the USCT days because they couldn't replace them fast enough when the Civil War was technically over. So there's some guys who actually served into 66 and 67 who are from regiments that were recruited in 64 and 65. Brian, do you have a question?
Yeah, Bill. So you mentioned about recruitment. Where were the recruiting stations? And I guess you mentioned a demographic, but what I guess was the main motivation? Maybe this is self-explanatory. I don't know. Motivations for soldiers to enlist in these units in the regular army as opposed to doing something else.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm going to give you the best answer I can. I'm sure there are multiple answers. I think at the end of the Civil War, the first motive African Americans have is to try to reunite their families. The next motive they have is to start to create these institutions, banks, churches, all kinds of social mutual assistance organizations. But many people didn't have a job to go to. African Americans were left out of the job market on so many levels. So here you have an organization that is part of the federal government that will give you a uniform, will feed you to some extent, take care of your medical care, that will do all of these different things to sustain you. And it gives you a chance for a career if you want one, which was really not available to anybody else. I can't think of any other federal career or even long-term private career that and especially for a person without a lot of education. You will, and I may get to this later, I might have done it last time, but the US military educational system is alleged today to be the largest single educational institution on the planet. And it grew from the need to provide not only religious guidance to Black troops, but a rudimentary education because of the tons of paperwork that existed then and now, of course, in the Army. So it was actually a fairly attractive opportunity. It wasn't necessarily seen as an opportunity of last resort. There were Europeans coming here for whom they didn't know the language, it was all they had. And they joined the Army, learned English, became whatever they became. Many of them got out, many of them stayed. But I think that it was attractive because it also gave you a chance for rank promotion and a certain kind of power. Also remember that these Black men as soldiers had the opportunity to actually testify in courts martial and vote in elections, which were often illegally privileges denied to other African Americans. So did I get to the bottom of your question or a little bit?
Oh no, you did a good job, thank you. But where were I guess their recruiting stations? So basically, I want to join the Army, the regular Army. It's 1868. Where do I go?
Well, there are different places. Sometimes they would actually rent, a corner office somewhere. Sometimes they were in post offices, but not unlike a lot of recruiting stations today, they just sort of rent a storefront and install an officer and an enlisted person to keep the books. The officer and that enlisted person would have quarters probably nearby, and you'd go there, and they would bring in a contract surgeon to do the very rudimentary physical. We all know that Kathy Williams was involved with one of the early Black infantry regiments. Clearly nobody did a very thorough physical examination of her. They would have kicked her out before she got in. You know that story about this woman who was in, I think, the 38?
Yeah, there's been a picture circulating everywhere on Facebook, and it's not her because there is no photograph of her. I do know that, and I debunked that on my Civil War page. But I understand that she was with the 38th USCI. But if she was in after that, that's another thing. But I do know.
Well, but it was the 38th US Colored Infantry, But I mean, the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st were actually technically post-Civil War. They actually were the 4 infantry regiments
Okay.
added to the 2 9th and 10th cavalry regiments. Then in 69, they were reorganized into the 24th and 25th. So they consolidated the outside 2 as the 24th and the inside 2 as the 25th.
Yeah.
And in terms of recruitment, I did a recruiting scenario with the Hannibal Guard out at Harper's Ferry a few years back, and I realized that the regulations have a loophole. If you look at the medical director's guide for inspecting troops or inspecting recruits, it is thorough to the point of turn your head and cough. There is no way a woman could pass. But in the regs, it says the recruit will be examined by a surgeon if available. Otherwise, it's up to the recruiting officer, who in many cases, actually most cases, is a second lieutenant and not the brightest bulb on the string. So there's a lot of eyeballing going on instead of the actual thorough medical exam. Just threw that out.
A good point. And you were getting points. I don't think you could say you got sort of bonuses, but you got points for filling your quota as you were sent on this duty. Because when you think about it, you're at some poor post somewhere, and all of a sudden you get to go to Pittsburgh for a couple of months. That seems at the time like a pretty attractive opportunity. Okay, well, thanks for that. And we can always come back to these things, but I thought it'd be good to let you get the questions as they kind of come up. The next one is about Army marksmanship in the Black regiments. As you folks all well know, before the end of the Civil War, the Army began to experiment with new firearms technologies that looked at utilizing fixed metallic cartridges to replace single-shot muzzleloaders. This experiment was finally deemed a success, and beginning in 1873, a new standard firearm began to see use. And of course, there's interim firearms in between, but we're talking about the 73 trapdoor Springfield. Infantry soldiers used a Springfield trapdoor rifle that fired a .45-70 caliber cartridge. The cavalry fired a shorter carbine version of the same gun, but with the same cartridge in the same size, but loaded with less gunpowder. It was a .45-55. While legend has Buffalo soldiers getting hand-me-down surplus equipment, we know that all troops of the 10th Cavalry had received the new carbines and revolvers by the end of June 1875, in keeping with the issue of the same arms to other regiments. The defeat of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry Command in 1876 made many Army officers take a new look at the need for marksmanship training. By 1879, the Army had finally adopted a systematic approach to target practice, and increased amounts of time and ammunition were expended in the training of soldiers. Many Black soldiers had been born enslaved and therefore had little prior experience with firearms. Like the rest of the Army, they soon became caught up in the rage for long-range marksmanship and the special privileges that would come from being a top regimental or departmental shooter. Perhaps Buffalo soldiers just enjoyed competitive target shooting, but in marksmanship, they knew that their race could not be held against them. When they won, they had to know it was because of their skill, and that it could bring a recognition that no amount of racism could tarnish. Horace Bivens of the 10th Cavalry wrote, "My first target practice with the rifle was at San Carlos. It was the first time that I'd ever shot a rifle. I made sharpshooter in that year and have ever since led my troop in marksmanship. I represented my troop winning 8 medals and badges at the department competition." This means that because of Army marksmanship, Black men were engaged in integrated sporting events, if you will, 50 years before Jesse Owens was even born. So it's an interesting little piece. Any questions about marksmanship before we move on? Prior to the rage for marksmanship training, the only time you would likely get to even fire your gun was at the end of guard duty. So they really went from 0 to 60. And you could argue by the turn of the 19th to 20th century, there was no better army or military marksman on the planet than the US soldier. But prior to that, fairly indifferent. The next piece is about the army barracks. The soldiers called it home. When not in the field or on detached duty for various reasons, soldiers called a barracks home. Large, uncomfortable, and often poorly built structures, barracks were usually hot in the summer and cold in the winter. Each infantry company or cavalry troop was generally assigned a single barracks. Half would be sent to a squad room where the men would set up their few belongings on shelves or in footlockers and arrange themselves along the lines of a pecking order peculiar to soldiers. In the black regiments, the more experienced men, nicknamed old soldiers, regardless of their age, would often take the bunks near the windows in the summer and move near the wood-burning stoves in the winter. The new recruits, called young soldiers in the black regiments, would have to make do with what was left. A man's closest friend or most bitter enemy was his bunkie. That is to say, the man who slept nearby. But until 1871, two soldiers literally shared a pair of blankets to conserve heat and save the army money. So you actually had bunks that were two on the bottom, two on the top. And, you know, to give yourself a little freedom, it was head to foot. So you got to smell the other guy's feet all night. In 1871, the Army finally purchased bunks that allowed each man to sleep in his own bed, but the term bunkie continued to refer to the comrade in the next bunk who might be a confidant, a friend, or a bully. Corporals slept in the squad rooms, but first sergeants were often able to live in a private room at the end of the barracks that served as their office and their bedroom. A black frontier recruit looked forward to the day when he'd be honored with the affectionate title of old soldier and was accepted as a competent soldier in the ranks. The company commander might occasionally enter the barracks to taste the soup in the kitchen or to conduct the Sunday morning inspection, but the barracks was generally a place that belonged to the enlisted men. To an old soldier, it mattered less what the captain thought than what the rest of the men in the barracks thought. The barracks was a place where the men could read a newspaper, smoke a cigar, share a joke, or swap tales of past adventures in the fields or misadventures at local off-post brothels and gambling dens, commonly known to soldiers as hog ranches. Whether in the Army for a single enlistment or a 30-year career, the barracks meant just one thing to a Buffalo soldier: it meant home. Any questions about the barracks before we go to the field and on patrol?
Yes.
Sure, Ed.
The sleeping conditions that you just described, was that unique to black soldiers?
It was not. It was not. The only thing that was unique is the terminology. Apparently, there are only a few things that are really different for black troops. One is in terms of their food ration. Everybody got the same food ration, you know, salt, pork, and this and this and this. But interestingly, the black troops actually consumed, generally speaking, their rice ration. White troops would either refuse the rice ration or take it in small amounts. Many white troops thinking that rice was only for the sick. You make a gruel out of it and serve it to people who were very sick. But black troops figured out, hell, this is food. And it's food that can be prepared in a multitude of ways. So that was different. And the old soldiers, new soldiers thing was different. Very else really turns out to be much different, other, as I said, than the racism. There might have been a few sort of slang terms, but I can't even tell you, other than old soldier and new soldier, what that might have been. But good question. Anybody else before we move on? Okay, well, the next one is called Taking the Field, Buffalo Soldiers on Patrol and in Combat. The endless drudgery of life in garrison was occasionally broken by the sheer terror of combat. The average soldier never heard a shot fired in anger, but those that did never forgot the sound of it. The job of a soldier was to do the bidding of the political leaders and the citizens who demanded that Indian peoples be moved off the lands that they had loved and lived on for ages, and this would be a dirty business. When the orders came for the men to prepare for a campaign in the field, the experienced men knew what to do. They found ways to obtain an onion or a potato to augment their scanty field rations of salted beef or salted pork, dried desiccated vegetables, beans, and coffee. Soldiers packed their food ration in canvas haversacks, filled their canteens, and stuffed their ammunition belts with cartridges. The frontier soldier had to rely on a minimum amount of gear. Traveling light meant a soldier carried a half tent, barely 5 feet long, a single blanket, a rubber-coated cloth poncho, mess gear, and very little else. The Plains tribes that they fought were highly skilled as both warriors and tacticians. When fighting began, Indian warriors often had a decided advantage and focused on fighting on ground of their own choosing. The Indian advantage in tactics could sometimes be overcome by the long-range firepower superiority of the Springfield rifles and carbines carried by the soldiers. People often ask, why did the Indians seem to have repeating Winchester-type firearms and the soldiers had the single-shot trapdoors? Well, those trapdoors are sighted in up to 1,500 yards. The Winchesters in those days were mostly in pistol calibers. Even in a rifle gun, a longer rifle carbine, you can only expect so much distance out of that kind of a round. In fact, the 4570 is still a fairly popular round even today for hunting purposes and as a brush gun. But what's really awkward about the history of that cartridge, as far as I know, it's the only cartridge specifically developed by the US government to kill Americans, specifically American Indians. So it's just a tough legacy. Combat was often fierce, confusing, and often was over almost as fast as it began. The grueling marching on lean rations and in difficult weather could seem to go on forever. While the cavalry could travel in a little more comfort than the infantry, after a few days on campaign, the foot soldiers could often outdistance the mounted troops. When an infantryman finally got to camp, he and his bunkie could set up their dog tent, while the cavalryman still had to care for his horse before he could fall exhausted into his blankets. At the end of a long march, tired, sore, cold, wet, and hungry, the men of the Black regiments knew that it was this difficult duty that earned them their $13 a month. Any questions before we go on to Buffalo Soldiers in Colorado?
You mentioned the $13 a month. I know in 64, the base pay of privates was increased to 16. Did they knock that back down or just?
They not only knocked it back down, but out of that 13, you still had to pay the laundress. And the laundress got usually $1 a day from each soldier. I'm sorry, $1 a month from each soldier. So, and the commanding officer's wife, colloquially known as the KOW, not the COW, often had a charity that she was asking for. And when she asked, the fellows had to pony up. And there was a 25-cent a month charge, which went to a fund for you for the old soldiers' home in Washington. So there were retractions.
That was regular Army before the Civil War too, the deduction. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
No worries. So because this exhibit, which went up in 1995, was in Colorado, there's a bit on Buffalo Soldiers in Colorado. Colorado was the scene of some of the earliest action involving Black frontier regulars. Troop I of the 10th Cavalry fought against a force of 100 Cheyenne near Big Sandy Creek in September of 1868. The men dismounted and fought the much larger Cheyenne force. Later that year, a party of white soldiers and civilian scouts under Major George Forsyth were surrounded and besieged by a large force of Cheyenne warriors at Beecher Island in eastern Colorado. When word got out that the men needed help, troops H and I of the 10th were part of the force that rode to relieve the troops at that place. Making a forced march from Cheyenne Wells, Colorado, the Buffalo Soldiers of Captain Lewis Carpenter's Troop H, also known as the Black Horse Troop, in those days, they tried as possible to keep every cavalry troop with one color horse. So when a horse came back without a rider, you knew from which troop it was from. So these would have been the Black Horse Troop. Private Reuben Waller of H Troop fought in the engagement and lived many years to the age of 105. Even after 70 years, he remembered the rescue vividly. He described the great sensation the rescue caused and how the survivors greeted the Black soldiers. There went up a cheer that made the valley ring, he said, and strong men grasped hands and then flung their arms around each other and laughed and cried. Perhaps as telling as the emotional welcome the men of the 10th got was a secret party hosted in their honor by the Beecher Island Scouts near Pond Creek. The party refused to honor the unofficial policy of segregation then so popular in the United States. Still, at Pond Creek, there was little chance of being discovered. The Scouts shared their thanks and their whiskey with the Black soldiers. Reuben Waller would remember, they sure treated us Black soldiers right for what we had done for them. The Scouts would have us drink, and we did not resent their courtesy. Between 1875 and 1877, Black soldiers from the 9th Cavalry were stationed at Fort Garland in southwest Colorado. The post was described by one observer as a rectangular group of adobe buildings, flat-roofed, squat, and altogether dispirited in their unmitigated ugliness, with the United States flag, clinging to a central pole. Despite this uninviting air, the men of the 9th Cavalry performed their duties well. Black troopers from Fort Garland spent time away from the post engaged in such duties as removing white settlers from the Ute Reservation and providing security during disputes over treaty violations committed by white miners and settlers in the state. In 1879, Company D found themselves on the march again, this time to patrol out of a base camp in Middle Park, that is west of Denver in the mountains. Indian agent Nathan Meeker sent word that trouble was imminent at the White River Indian Agency, and troops from Fort Fred Steele in Wyoming were dispatched. When the message arrived in Middle Park, Captain Frank Dodge and Troop D saddled their horses and made a ride toward the agency. En route, they came on the soldiers from Fort Fred Steele. The Wyoming soldiers had run into Ute warriors who considered their presence an act of war. Those soldiers were pinned down for 6 days and 6 nights. Joining the fray, Troop D boldly rode into the rifle pits and got in on the fighting. Captain Dodge later stated that his Buffalo soldiers had asked to charge the Indian position, but were not permitted to do so. The Black soldiers fought along their beleaguered party for several days with little water and the stench of rotting flesh from the horses killed in the fighting. Additional soldiers finally arrived on the 5th of October. Now outgunned, the Utes wisely withdrew, ending the stalemate. Captain Lawson of the original besieged party spoke volumes about the racial views of the day when he exclaimed about the Black soldiers that rode to his rescue, quote, "They were the whitest men he ever saw," unquote.
That's a compliment, I assume.
Well, I think he meant it as one. I don't know that it is. But, you know, again, this is right from the lips of a white officer at the time. The next bit is called Under the Shadow of Old Glory, Racism and Segregation in the Frontier Military. And I think we're kind of getting toward the end, and that's probably okay. But again, questions are very much welcome. In the days after the Civil War, the Frontier Army was a haven for Black men. The Army had its doubts about what many considered a social experiment. At first, it must have seemed to many that Buffalo soldiers were able to leave racism many miles behind, but this was not to be so. Over time, the Army became a place where segregation was strictly enforced and assignments were often guided by stereotypes and prejudice. Hatred of Black soldiers seemed at its worst in Texas, a state that had been part of the old Confederacy. In the Lone Star State, Black soldiers were sometimes unfairly denied rations and quarters and were refused rides on the same stagecoaches that they were assigned to protect. When one stagecoach driver took a shot at a Buffalo soldier near Berea Springs, Texas in 1872, the trooper coolly returned fire, killing his assailant. And he did not go to jail. In 1881, a Buffalo soldier and a white soldier from another regiment were killed in separate shootings in San Angelo, now San Angelo, Texas. As a result, Black and white soldiers banded together and had a poster printed as a warning to the citizens of the town. Here's what the poster said: We, soldiers of the United States Army, do hereby warn cowboys, etc., of San Angelo and vicinity to recognize our rights of way as just and peaceable men. If we do not receive justice in fair play, which we must have, someone will suffer, if not the guilty, the innocent. It has gone too far, justice or death, US soldiers, one and all. Racism did not only exist in Texas, but sprang up all across the frontier as soon as the immediate perceptions of danger from Indians had passed. One resident of Middle Park, Colorado, remarked that the Black troopers assigned there in 1879 looked to him like, quote, a gang of Negro minstrels, unquote. One Black trooper recuperating from injuries received in the line of duty was ordered back to his duty station from the U.S. General Hospital at Hot Springs, Arkansas. Because of his race, he was unable to purchase anything to eat or drink on the train or at the stations. The soldier went 48 hours without even a cup of coffee. Even under the heavy hand of racism and the lynch law, the men of the Black regiments received high praise. The 1889 annual report from the Secretary of War stated that, quote, Black troops were neat, orderly, and obedient, are seldom brought before court-martial, and rarely desert. In most cases, the soldier's response was not violence, but an attempt to vent his disappointment and defend his reputation as a soldier. One Buffalo soldier, Private Thomas A. Ernest, wrote, the 24th is one of the cleanest, best drilled, and most disciplined regiments in the United States. The Negro is known for his obedience to and respect for law and order. We object to being classed as lawless barbarians. We are proud of our regiment's reputation and are confident of our ability to maintain it. Sergeant Barney McKay of Troop G of the 9th U.S. Cavalry stationed at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, was more direct when he issued this warning to citizens of nearby Crawford. He said, you lynch, you torture, and you burn Negroes in the South, but we swear by all that is good and holy that you shall not outrage us and our people right here under the shadow of Old Glory, not while we have shot and shell. And if you persist, we will reduce your homes and firesides to ashes and your guilty souls to hell. Perhaps one of the most eloquent reminders of the ugly stigma of racism on the frontier came from Private Edward A. Johnson, who wrote, let it be said that the Negro soldier did his duty under the flag, whether that flag protects him or not. The men of the Black regiments faced danger in the field against skilled and wary Indian warriors intent on protecting their families and homes. But Buffalo soldiers faced an even more implacable enemy, American racism. Even as they prevailed against American Indians, they lost the silent battle they'd waged for citizenship and civil rights. A post-Civil War America, taken in by anti-Black propaganda, offered limitless opportunity and freedom to immigrants and lent aid to foreign countries abroad while turning its back on African Americans at home. Racism became acceptable and laws were enacted that legitimized segregation and oppression, turned a blind eye to racial violence, and denied African Americans their rights as citizens. Congress considered deauthorizing Black regiments while some white officers freely quoted the dogma of white racial superiority. In the end, a Buffalo soldier only had two choices. He could quit in disgust and take up menial tasks in civilian life, or stick it out and retire a soldier after 30 years. The last bit is called a legacy of hardship. Can you hear okay? Okay. One officer who remained loyal to the men of his Black regiment wrote what would become an epitaph for these Black frontiersmen. All that men could do, they did. 18 Buffalo soldiers received the Medal of Honor, then as now the most distinguished recognition made to military personnel by the government of the United States. A primary motive for the Buffalo soldiers seems to have been to gain their rights as citizens. These men were not different in their tasks, but in overcoming the barriers they had to overcome, placed in their way by the Army, the citizens of the West, and the people of the United States. Buffalo soldiers brought a new kind of diversity to the West. It was not just a diversity of names, faces, and skin colors, but a diversity of dreams and accomplishments against great odds. Some stayed after the fighting ended, many did not, but in the end, they all contributed to the history of the American West. So gentlemen, that brings me to the end of my prepared remarks. What questions might we have?
Well, first, I'm glad I finally pushed the record button. That was excellent, Bill. Thanks.
I apologize for the noise, but there's nothing much I can do about it.
I didn't hear much in the background.
Great.
So
well, anyway, as I said before, I think a lot of this is muddled because of the sort of the way it's been picked up by popular media. This is a story that has its roots, of course, in the Civil War with the Black service of troops, but it has its own life. It has its own trajectory, and it's an interesting period. If you'd like to learn more about these fellows, there are plenty of books, but one I'm reading right now that I think is quite good is called The Regular Army O by Douglas C. McChristian. First-rate piece of work. And Black troops are not assigned a specific chapter. They're throughout the whole book.
I had two thoughts when you were speaking. One of them was the insistence on the status as regular soldiers of the United States, even to the extent of dropping color, just 10th United States Cavalry. During the Civil War, there was stuff like that too. The first USCT out of the district, when Holman had the regiment on provost duty in Portsmouth, he issued this proclamation to the citizens saying, "My men are regular soldiers of the United States, and they will be treated as such." And I know that there was the commissary sergeant, the 2nd United States Colored Infantry, was regular correspondent to the Weekly Anglo-African. He also wrote a letter of complaint to President Lincoln about something, but he signed it as, Commissary Sergeant James Taylor, 2nd United States Infantry, colored. But he still had the colored in there, but it was like United States Infantry, insisting on that. And I thought that was a moving detail in and of itself. The other thing I was thinking of is you talked about educational institution. And then again, the second that I'm fixated on right now, they had a company fund or a regimental fund, very much like the regular army before the war, where you took contributions from the sutler. He was actually taxed for each man that he had as a customer. And there was a tax on the soldiers, and then there was the surplus in the commissary fund went to a regimental fund. And one of the first things that was used for, besides instruments for the band, was a schoolhouse. And I'm wondering if that's one of the ways they kept up education in the
by the time of this period, certainly after about 1875, they had regimental chaplains. Most of the other posts that didn't have Black troops had post chaplains, and they were often contract employees. So these guys were actually assigned to a regiment. They'd have to do sort of, moving around to go to all the different, because they were separated often by 1 or 2 companies here, 1 or 2 companies there. You didn't have a fort with a whole regiment of any sort. So there was that. But you're quite right. There was also a company fund. And a lot of the Black regiments were so proud of their service, they would use that often not only to buy sports equipment, but plates and cups with their regimental crest emblazoned on them. And so you sit down in 10th U.S. Cav and with the cross sabers and a whole bit. But one of the most touching stories, and I think I may have touched on this the first time, in the 10th Cav at Fort Davis, there was a fellow who had gone back to South Carolina somewhere and had gone hunting with a shotgun. The shotgun blew up and he was blinded and was just incapacitated. He didn't have 30 years. And the men used the company fund to bring him back, and he became their sort of mascot / porter. And he would polish shoes and clean guns. He would do anything he could because they were paying for his survival, because they weren't going to let an old soldier rot under a tree in South Carolina somewhere. So there's some really touching things that happen as a result of this stuff.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Hey, Bill, I had one question. Well, as everyone else said, excellent presentation. Really,
Thank you,
really
sir.
appreciate your just informing us and filling in a lot of the chapter on these Buffalo Soldiers. You mentioned about them, I guess, being the first, as you described it, the first government employees.
Federal, yeah, that's subject, of course, any number of perspectives, but that's my perspective, yes.
Right, and well, one, I know that someone before considered the United States colored troops to be regular Army soldiers, and I know that that's not true. But I guess my only question was, to my knowledge, I believe that there were some African Americans who were, I guess, government employees in a sense before this, before the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, the quality of their jobs, if they had menial jobs or whatever, I guess being employed by the government is the thing that I'm thinking of. And I guess I mostly know that from my involvement with Fort Stevens Day of the government clerks, as one newspaper put it, white and colored, who came out and they were given arms or whatever it was. But I just was curious about that. Again, I believe that there were some blacks who were employed by the government before, maybe even before the Civil War. Did they have, jobs with retirement plans and benefits and all that? I don't know about that. Anything above sweeping with a broom, I don't know. But that's all I'm just curious about.
No, and I mean, it is a little bit of a flag waving moment for me. I mean, it may
Sure.
be completely true, it may be almost true, it may be partially true, it may not be true at all.
Sure,
But I
got you.
can tell you that, for instance, Jacob Dotson, who was a black man who was riding with Fremont back in the 1840s, he had a job, as sort of sergeant at arms at the Capitol.
Oh yeah, that's right. I know about who you're talking about. Yeah, I forgot about him. Yeah.
So now, was it a temporary job? Was he there as, because Fremont? I have no way to know. But
Right.
it is an interesting and rather unusual way to look at the service of these black troops, because it turns the focus. It's not just, shoot an Indian shoot at you. That's the Hollywood version. There's a lot more going on there in terms of their motives, in terms of their opportunities. And one of the most fascinating places to look, of course, and then you would know this is what you do, but the applications for pensions are just fascinating. I was here, and then I was moved to here, and then I got injured, and then I did this, and then I did that. And I will tell you a real quick story from one of my relatives. This is John R. Anderson. I told you he went from private to corporal to private to corporal to private. And I got these records from the National Archives, and he gets called. He gets out of the Army, and he comes back to the Army, and he picks up on a bonus for coming back. And 3 or 4 months go by, and then he gets a notice to appear for a court martial. And oh crap, he's got to go and report, and he's got an officer, who's going to be his lawyer, and they're the 3 judges. And one of them says to him in this report, Anderson, what do you mean by being dumb enough to leave the Army on a medical disability, join back up, take the bonus for re-enlisting, and not even being smart enough to change your name? Because there was a lot of that going on at the time. And according to the records, he said, well, sirs, there were 3 of them, I have but 2 things to say in my defense. One is, I have here my character reference, and as you can see, it is excellent, the highest character reference available in the Army. The second thing I would have the court to understand is that my piles hurt me something fierce in the cavalry. In the infantry, they don't bother me at all. Piles being a period term for hemorrhoids. Well, apparently there had to be at least, this is speculation now, at least 1 cavalry officer on that panel of judges, because they laughed his ass out of there. He didn't do a day in the guardhouse. He went back to his regiment and finished his tour of duty. So yeah, court-martial records are an interesting source of information as well. So fascinating, fascinating stuff. And I got to tell you, a lot of the interest in and access to records at your location was courtesy of my old friend, now long departed, Sarah Dunlap Jackson, who was just a fantastic person. And I don't know if
I
anybody.
think she was before my time.
It was most certainly before your time. She's
Yeah.
been gone 20 years at least,
Oh, okay.
but what a lovely person.
Okay. Okay.
So anyway, but everybody, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to the next meeting. It's going to be on uniforms, I think.
Yes, we're going to have Marvin Alonzo Greer speak on uniforms, and I've seen a presentation or the slide deck on the Hannibal Guards Facebook page, and I think, you know, he just did an excellent job of not just showing the different uniforms, but showing Black troops actually wearing these uniforms.
Nice.
And there's a degree of individuality and even customization that comes out that really adds a whole new dimension to just talking about uniforms. So looking forward to that. And then the next one after that will be you again with part 2 of Buffalo Soldiers.
Actually, Michael, I already did number 1.
Okay.
So this was number 2. At least that's
Okay.
what I think. Now, the good news
No,
is that
actually,
the
this was supposed to be number 1 for this group. But
okay, well, that's great, because if I have another one, I've got the other half.
okay, we'll do it.
Number 1.
We'll
for
do
number
it,
2.
and then we'll see. You know, we'll see if we get some other people interested. And you know, I know that we're increasingly able to get back together in person, but I think we'll keep this going as long as there are a few people interested.
Well, it may be a
Doesn't
while
cost me
before I
anything
can
more
get
than I
back in
already
person.
paid, and I don't have to travel. So this, I think, is a good way to stay in touch and learn some things. And I really appreciate what you did this evening. You got a great radio voice. You should hopefully Ken Burns will call you up sometime, and we'll get a new narrator for a better version of the Civil War.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bill. I think you did a great job, man.
Well, thank
Really
you.
appreciate it. Good seeing you. Thank you a lot. And you too, Mike. Thanks for putting these on.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
And
Here's to a new holiday.
I switched to water, but I'll drink to that.
And
All right.
happy Father's Day to all you guys too.
Oh,
Yes.
Everybody,
Well, happy Juneteenth, and
Yeah.
we can talk about that at a different time.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
okay. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks,
And,
everybody.
Hey guys.
Okay.
Thanks.